Welcome again to Profiles. I'm Charlie Walters. This show is a production of Nantucket Community Television, Channel 18. My guest today is Charity Grafe Mofsen, who is the Associate Director of Nantucket Operations for the Museum of African American History. Welcome to the show, Charity Grafe.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
What is the museum?
The Museum of African American History is based in Boston, and we also have our campus here on Nantucket. We focus on 19th century African American history, mainly in the two areas, Boston and Nantucket.
And how does it happen that the two branches of operation are in Nantucket and in Boston?
Like I said, based out of Boston, that was established first. Several years later, the museum acquired the property at 29 York Street. We have the African Meeting House, several additional structures as well, along with the Seneca Boston Florence Higginbotham House. Fortunately, some people remembered the history, and they informed team members in Boston, and they were able to acquire it in 1989, 1990.
And the Boston operation, as you were saying, goes back to about 1970 or so.
Yes.
Okay.
A bit further back than that.
Now, the African Meeting House, as you say, on York Street at Five Corners,
Yes.
for those who don't know the neighborhood that well. Tell us about that building.
So the African Meeting House was originally built and established in 1825, and it was to serve the community as a church, a school, and a meeting space, a school prior to integration on the island. The location of the building, as you'll see when you go through that intersection, is very strategic, and it makes a lot of sense how it was placed there, why it was placed there. Everybody has to come through there. And so even today, for many people who may not even know what the building is, they know of that corner.
They certainly do. Whether they know that building or not, they've all been through Five Corners at one time or another.
Yeah.
It is basically a one-room building.
Mm-hmm. It is. By the time the museum got a hold of the space, it hadn't been in use in a long time. So they spent, a good 10 years restoring the building. When they originally acquired it, the pews were missing, chandelier was missing, the windows were boarded up. So they had a lot of work to do, but it's been beautifully restored.
Well, it has been. And I know for years, I would bicycle by or walk by that building, and I had no idea what it was.
Yeah.
You wouldn't know what it was.
Right.
Now, is that the only structure on that piece of land?
No, we have 5 structures altogether. So we have the African Meeting House that stands right on the corner of York and Pleasant Streets. Right next to that, what used to be a chicken coop. We now have some very luxurious restrooms in there. In the middle, the little cottage is going to be our new welcome center, our visitor center. And so I'll have an office in there. There's an extra space, so as we grow, there will be additional space for part-time helper or interns. Then we have the large house. It's technically 27 York Street, and that is the Seneca Boston Florence Higginbotham House, which dates back to the late 1700s. And so that is currently being restored right now. We're hopeful that the restoration will be completed by the end of 2018. And once it's completed, the downstairs will be available for tours. Upstairs, we'll keep that as living quarters, so we can actually have visiting professors, lecturers, and know that they actually have a place to stay. Same thing with hiring interns. You know as well as I do, on Nantucket we've got a housing crisis, so
yes, we do.
Being able to make sure that they have a place to stay when we reach out to these scholars is really important. And then on the other side of the house, there's an old garage. And that, we're all really excited about that because that's going to be our education center. Thanks to the Wheezy Foundation, we've received some extra funding that should help us complete that pretty quickly. So.
Now, the meeting house you said was built in 1825,
Mm-hmm.
and there are a lot of old structures on Nantucket, but if I'm correct, that makes it older than most of the houses in that neighborhood. Never mind the whole island, but
Right.
just even within that neighborhood,
Right.
it's an older house.
Exactly. And the same thing with the Seneca Boston Florence Higginbotham house. 1774, is when that property was first established. So it's a beautiful property, in general, but knowing what it symbolizes and the fact that it's left over from a time where that whole neighborhood, was predominantly people of color. 1774, Seneca Boston, even though he was one of the first, he was not the only one. By 1774, that neighborhood was already being established. So,
I'm going to guess that the land the buildings sit on comes to about, what, 1/10 of an acre maybe? Something like that, probably. Okay, that's just eyeballing it. That
now,
may be completely inaccurate.
originally, the original property, Seneca Boston, his property actually extended from where the house sits now all the way down to Orange Street. So he had a
Really?
significant piece of
That
land.
is a lot of land.
So.
One of the neighboring houses, diagonally across 5 corners from the meeting house, is where Absalom Boston lived at one point. Tell us about him.
So Absalom Boston was the son of Seneca Boston and his wife, Thankful Micah, who is Wampanoag. And Absalom Boston would go on to become a whaling captain. He had an all-black whaling crew, which is, this is the history that actually brought me to the island, because I was blown away hearing about black whaling captains and entire black whaling crews. But Absalom Boston, he took this crew out. They went on one famous voyage, but they all made it back, and that was incredibly special because whaling is dangerous, obviously. So for any whaling crew to make it back in one piece, that was a big deal. But for an all-black whaling crew, it was an even bigger deal because the second they left the safety of Nantucket, these guys could have been captured, sold back into slavery, murdered for sport, not to mention all of the other normal dangers that came with whaling. So they came back, and because of the fact that there was a lot of money to be made in the whaling industry, and the whaling industry didn't discriminate, these guys, they came back with that money and they put it right back into their community.
Interesting. And they obviously weren't tempted by Tahiti, as so many whalemen were.
Right.
They would get off there and that would be it.
Right, no, they came back home.
How big is your staff?
So our staff right now, I'm currently the only staff person on Nantucket. We have a larger team in Boston, but we are a very small nonprofit. As we continue to grow, I'm definitely looking forward to being able to expand and have additional staff people on the island.
For you, this is a year-round position.
Yes.
Is it year-round full-time?
Yes. Our hours are obviously different in the off season, but we're always available for appointments. So even in the middle of January, somebody can call or email, and we'll schedule a private tour. And it's actually kind of nice doing the private tours.
So if I were to come and knock on your door later on today, what would I see inside the meeting house?
The meeting house on a normal day like today, it's quiet, it's peaceful. You would come in, you would see me, and I would give you a tour. I would share several of our stories about the people who were here, the people that helped establish the community in that area, and I would tell you about the rest of the campus and what we have planned for the future. We also have regular programs that will take place throughout the year. Concerts, lectures, lots of live music though. The acoustics in the African Meeting House are phenomenal. So,
Well, tell us about some of those programs we've had in the past. and what's coming up for that matter.
Okay. So we do a lot of, like I said, we do a lot of live music, lecture series. We have an annual Spriggs lecture that is in honor of Frank and Betty Spriggs, who were some of the first site managers at the African Meeting House. And so we'll have that lecture series that usually takes place in August, early August. And our Jazz Before Sunset concert series that's sponsored by Neville and Kathy Richin, that will officially start up the end of June. It starts the last Saturday of every month, and that'll run through the end of October. We may push it out through November. We'll see how things go. But we're always available for rentals, weddings. When I first started at the museum, we were 2 babies that were baptized, and I think their grandfather was one of the architects who helped on the restoration of the African Meeting House.
So there are lots of different things going on in that building.
Absolutely.
And I'm assuming that's the way it was 200 years ago when the building was first built. So
like I said, community space, school, church. So we're not open for regular, religious services now, but we definitely try to keep our doors open for as many different events as possible.
Might you be open for services at some point in the future if the situation arose? You're not
Because
avoiding it, in other words.
It's not that we're avoiding it. It's simply we're a 501c3. As a nonprofit, we have to remain neutral, but we are definitely open to different types of events. So, and when it comes to rentals, there's definitely a bit more flexibility there as well.
Tell us about yourself. How did you come to Nantucket? What were you doing before then?
So I came for my first visit to the island. My now husband, he grew up spending summers here, and so he brought me on family vacation summer of 2015, and I thought Nantucket was beautiful, but it wasn't until we went to visit the African Meeting House that I really started to fall in love with the island. I was completely blown away by the history. I'm originally from North Carolina, so growing up, for me, the Black history that I got, I never heard anything about Black whaling captains, or entire established neighborhoods in the 1700s. The Black history that I got was very limited, usually limited to, talking about slavery, in February, Black History Month, we'd hear about the greats, Harriet Tubman and Martin Luther King, and that would pretty much be the extent of it. So when I came here and, I heard about Seneca Boston and Absalom Boston and Edward Pompey and, all these other amazing people, Arthur Cooper, all these wonderful stories, and I got emotional. I was totally blown away. I told my husband, I told my now predecessor, Kamal McCarthy, who was working in the museum then, and I said, if this history is affecting me this way now, at like 30 years old, what if we started teaching our young people this, from the time they can understand what's going on, teaching them this history, so they know that, there were some horrible things that happened in the past, but that's not all that happened, and that's not all they came from, They came from whaling captains, they came from property owners, they came from entire communities figuring out ways to work together, long before they had any sort of example to follow. That's a game changer, I feel like that has the potential to really equip our young people with tools that they need in order to be successful, in order to be world changers. And so I told him then, I was like, if we ever have the opportunity to come here, even if it's just for a couple of years, a couple of months, I would love to do that, and I would love to get involved with the museum. And it's just a couple short months later that here we are.
So tell us what was going on between North Carolina for you and Nantucket. What else was going on in those 30 years?
I went out to, I worked for an IT company for a while. I was going to school for business, and when I got laid off, I decided to change everything. I moved out to Iowa, started a totally different educational programs. Sustainable residential design and development is my major, and so I like I said, I went out to Iowa. It's where I met my husband, and while we were out there is where I really started to develop a love for sustainability and historic preservation. Preservation done right, as far as I'm concerned, you're incorporating sustainability. And so coming to Nantucket, those are two things that I think kind of go hand in hand with a lot of things, but especially working on a historic campus where there's still currently a restoration project in place.
Where in Iowa was this?
Fairfield, Iowa. It's a small hippie school called Maharishi University.
Oh yes,
of
I've heard
Management.
of that. Yeah.
Really?
So, yeah. So you weren't in a city, in other words.
No.
You were in a more rural environment,
Absolutely.
which is more or less what you've come to.
Right.
More
right.
or less.
A
In
little bit
an
more
odd way.
sophisticated. Yeah.
I want to get back to the history of African Americans on Nantucket. In 2018, if you see an African American walking down the street, there's a good chance he or she is from Jamaica, Mississippi, maybe the Boston area, maybe the Cape. But in the 1600s and 1700s, that wouldn't have been the case.
Nope.
Were they coming straight from Africa, or were they coming to other places in the colonies and then ending up on Nantucket?
Right, right. So originally you had, some situations where African Americans on Nantucket were brought here by European families who were enslaving these African Americans. Eventually, you had other black people that were coming over that had the fortune of being born free elsewhere, and they would come to Nantucket because Nantucket was known for being a safe, or friendlier place for people of color. Eventually, by the late 1700s, early 1800s, Nantucket was a safe haven. So you knew if you escaped slavery and you made it to Nantucket, you were not only going to be left alone, but thanks to the whaling industry, you would hopefully have the opportunity to get involved in an industry that would pay you enough that you could create a really good life for yourself and your family. So you definitely started to see more people come from elsewhere in the country.
Well, this sounds familiar because nowadays Nantucket is a more welcoming place than most places
Right.
for anybody.
Right.
And there are sure plenty of jobs here.
Absolutely.
Places to stay, that's another story.
Right.
But there are plenty of jobs
exactly.
here.
Plenty of work to go around.
The Wampanoags, let's talk about that a little bit. There is a Wampanoag African-American connection on Nantucket.
Yes. So as I mentioned briefly earlier, Seneca Boston, he married Thankful Micah, who was Wampanoag, and they had 6 children that they raised in what we now call the Seneca Boston Florence Higginbotham House. One of those children would be Absalom Boston, who would go on to be a whaling captain. The Boston family, I think, they should definitely be considered, right up there with those founding Nantucket families as far as the contributions that they've made to the island. There's a lot of history wrapped up with the Boston family, the Pompeys, James Crawford, like I mentioned earlier, Arthur Cooper. So they're a very, very special family. You did see a lot of intermarrying between African Americans and Native Americans. It was legal. It took a while before interracial marriages between Caucasians and African Americans, or Caucasians and Native Americans, were legally recognized. But
Even in Massachusetts?
Even in Massachusetts, it wasn't. That being said, long before these interracial marriages were legally recognized, you can look at an old census from Nantucket, and it was still present here, and I think that it speaks to how progressive the island was. Just that, if people could respond honestly on a census without fear of, being arrested or being attacked, it's interesting to see that there was a lot of intermarrying.
Well, I've long thought that any community where you have a lot of transient people, tolerance of those who are different tends to go hand in hand.
Absolutely.
Now today it's tourism.
Mm-hmm.
There are tourists from all over the world.
Right.
Way back, centuries ago, there were seafaring people.
Mm-hmm.
And who knows where they came from, where they
Right.
were going, how long they would be here. So you get used to seeing people who don't look like you do.
Right, right. Same thing goes with, being on whaling ships. You didn't have the luxury of, saying, well, I'm only going to work with somebody that looks just like me. When you're out there, it's dangerous. You got hard work to do. You don't have time to discriminate. You have to figure out a way to
life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You better figure out a way to work together. And the same thing was happening back home here on the island. We're 30 miles out to sea. It's not rocket science. People had to figure out a way to work together. Even now we know it's only a matter of time. Like you're going to need your neighbors. You have to work together.
Yeah, exactly. Well, all of this said, there was an ugly incident at the meeting house in the winter of 2018.
Yes.
And tell us about that, if you would.
So March 11th, I received a phone call from dispatch, the local police department, that they had received some calls about our building being vandalized. And at the time, I don't know what I expected, but not what was there at all. In my mind, I thought it was something that I could easily go down, handle it, and go on with my day. My husband and I, when we drove down York Street and we made it into the intersection at Five Corners, I was speechless. I was blown away. There was a phallic symbol and the words spray painted "nigger leave" across our front door. And it's something that I haven't experienced since being on Nantucket. I'm not so naive as to think that there's no hate here, or no racism. I know that that's everywhere, at least the potential is everywhere. But everything that I had experienced here as far as racism or hate, it's always been subtle. Never something as blatant as spray paint across the building, especially across one of our historic buildings. I felt like that was something, an unspoken agreement that we've all made, that especially when it comes to our historic buildings, we have a respect, for our island, and what makes it so special, So I was shocked that it was so brazen. I was not shocked that the attitudes are here. I was very happy to see the outpouring of support from our community here.
And it was immediate.
It was immediate, yeah. And I think that it is perfectly in alignment with Nantucket's history. You can look back and see that, Nantucket's never been perfect, but there have always been good people here willing to speak up, when they need to speak up. So when bad things happen, other places, those bad things might just happen, and that might just be the end of it. But here, when something happens, people come out, they speak up, they say, not our Nantucket, and they realize that if this is not the Nantucket that we want, we're the ones who have to actively change that. You know, we're the ones who have to make Nantucket what we want it to be. It's not just going to happen on its own, you know.
Well, it was an attack on all of Nantucket in a way. But as you say, it's a reminder that as nice as it is here, it is not perfect. But it was also a reminder that when something really ugly happens, the community stands up and says, well, we're going to fix this.
Absolutely.
We don't like it. We don't want it to happen again.
Right.
Before we go, tell us when you're open
So we're
and
about
how
to.
people can contact you.
You can contact me directly. My email, cmofsen, M-O-F as in Frank, S as in Sam, E-N, at ma.org. It's MAAH.org. Our summer hours will be in effect, and so we'll be doing Tuesday through Saturday, 11 to 4, Sundays 12 to 4.
So you don't close for lunch in the summertime.
We will be closed for lunch. So that is, I'm in the process of hiring someone to work part-time in the afternoons. The past couple of summers that I've been on staff, it's a little difficult being the only staff person on the island, trying to take a lunch break. We're usually closed around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, so I can step out and breathe and eat for a moment. But
And this is 27 York Street. Do I have that right? Or
29 York Street
29.
is the African Meeting House. Officially, 27 York Street is the Seneca Boston Florence Higginbotham House.
And just a note for those who are in Boston or passing through, it's 46 Joy Street in Boston.
Absolutely.
Pretty much right behind the State House on Beacon Hill.
Yep, go check them out. Boston's African Meeting House is grand and absolutely beautiful. Nantucket's is not as grand, but it's just as beautiful. But I think it's a pretty neat experience to stand in both buildings to kind of get a feel for both of them. So if you have the opportunity to visit Nantucket's as well as Boston's, I definitely recommend that you do.
Charity Grace Mofsen, thank you for coming by today. This has
Thank you
been
so much.
fascinating.
Thank you for having me.
For Profiles, I'm Charlie Walters. Thanks for tuning in. Please tune in again next time.